Your sister gets the master suite so you and your children can take the floor. My mother-in-law threw two dusty sleeping bags at my feet. Beside her, my sister-in-law laughed, while her husband, my arrogant white brother-in-law, swirled his scotch. He smirked and told me I should be grateful his connections secured this Aspen estate. I looked down at my daughter shivering on the floor. I smiled, kneeled down, and whispered to my kids to pack their bags. We left at 11 at night. What they did not know was that I owned the very estate they were standing in, and I was about to cancel their entire reality. If you have ever been pushed too far by a toxic family, hit subscribe and stick around to hear how I taught them a lesson they will never forget. My name is Sasha. I am 33 and the CEO of a luxury property management firm called Aura Estates. I have kept this hidden from my husband Terrence's family for 8 years. As far as his mother Geraldine is concerned, I am just the girl from the south side of Chicago who trapped her successful son. She thinks I work a low-level administrative job. Terrence was on a business trip in London, leaving me to navigate the annual family Thanksgiving gathering alone with our 2 children, Miles and Layla. I quietly arranged for this spectacular mountain property through my company, comping the $20,000 a night reservation as a secret gift. I let them believe Preston had pulled some strings. The grand entrance of the Aspen estate featured soaring 20-foot ceilings and massive windows overlooking the mountains. It was beautiful, but the atmosphere inside was freezing. At 10:30 on Wednesday night, we had just arrived after a grueling drive. My children were exhausted, their small eyes heavy with sleep. Geraldine stood in the center of the massive living room, flanked by her daughter Vanessa and Vanessa's husband Preston. She tossed those 2 old camping bags onto the polished wood. "You are used to roughing it anyway," Geraldine said, her voice echoing off the stone fireplace. "The guest rooms are spoken for. Vanessa and Preston need the master suite because they appreciate the finer things. You can push that coffee table aside and sleep right here." I stared at the sleeping bags. They smelled like a damp basement. "Geraldine," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "The house has 8 bedrooms. Surely there is a bed for Miles and Layla." Preston stepped forward, the ice clinking in his glass. "Come on, Sasha." He flashed a condescending smile. "The master suite has a smart sauna and heated marble floors. You would not even know how to turn those things on. Just be grateful my corporate connections got us this place. It is completely booked out otherwise. You are lucky we even let you tag along." Vanessa adjusted her cashmere wrap and sighed heavily. "Honestly, Sasha, stop complaining. My flight was exhausting and the airline ran out of my favorite champagne. I am too drained to deal with your usual drama. We need the space to decompress. You should have booked a cheap motel down the highway if you wanted a bed. Oh wait, your paycheck cannot cover anything in this zip code." They laughed together, a unified front of arrogance and entitlement. This was standard behavior for the family. Since the day Terrence introduced me, Geraldine had made it her personal mission to remind me of my place. She was a prominent figure in her elite sorority and heavily involved in church politics where image was everything. To her, I lacked the proper pedigree. I lacked the wealth. I was the dark stain on her perfect family portrait. She constantly praised Vanessa for marrying a wealth broker like Preston, treating him like royalty while treating me like the hired help. They truly believed I was a gold digger who relied on Terrence for every cent. They had no idea that my quiet hustle had built a real estate empire or that I owned this very mansion. I looked away from their mocking faces and down at my children. Layla rubbed her tired eyes, clutching my leg. The draft from the massive windows made her shiver. Miles stood bravely beside her, holding his backpack, waiting for my reaction. They expected me to argue. They wanted me to yell to confirm their biased image of the angry woman from the wrong side of the tracks. Geraldine stood tall, waiting for the outburst she could later cry about to her church friends. Instead, I felt a deep, overwhelming calm wash over me, the kind of calm that only comes when you realize you hold all the power. I did not raise my voice. I bent down until I was eye level with my children. I smoothed Layla's hair and smiled warmly at both of them. "Pack your things, my sweet babies. I whispered softly to them. We are leaving this house right now. I stood up and took Layla's hand. Geraldine's triumphant smirk faltered slightly. If you walk out that door right now, she warned, her voice sharp with sudden authority, do not even think about showing your face at my birthday gala here on Saturday. I will not tolerate this disrespect. I did not give her the satisfaction of a response. I guided my children out into the freezing night, leaving the heavy oak door to shut firmly behind us. The crisp winter air filled my lungs as I helped Miles and Layla into the heated seats of my SUV. Once they were safely buckled in, I sat in the driver's seat and pulled out my tablet. I logged into my company system. I found the reservation under Preston's name. I clicked the red button to revoke their access, cancel the luxury catering, and shut down the heating system. The digital screen flashed cancellation confirmed. If you walk out that door right now, do not even think about showing your face at my 65th birthday gala here on Saturday. Geraldine's voice echoed through the massive foyer, slicing through the quiet mountain night. I will not tolerate this level of disrespect from someone my son dragged into this family. She stood with her arms crossed, her chin lifted in that familiar haughty way she reserved specifically for me. Behind her, Vanessa was rolling her eyes, while Preston poured himself another glass of bourbon, chuckling as if my departure was the punchline to a joke I was not wealthy enough to understand. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the reaction they were so desperately trying to provoke. Instead, I zipped up Layla's pink winter coat and pulled her knit hat over her ears. I handed Miles his backpack. We are leaving, I told my children, softly guiding them toward the heavy mahogany front door. Geraldine stepped forward, blocking my path. Her face was flushed with anger. Are you deaf, Sasha? I said. If you leave, you are done. Terrence will hear about how you threw a tantrum and ruined our family holiday. You can crawl back to the south side where you belong. I looked her directly in the eyes. I am hearing you perfectly, Geraldine. Enjoy the floor. I opened the door, and the biting Colorado wind rushed in. I ushered my children out into the snow, leaving the heavy door to shut firmly behind us, cutting off the sound of Vanessa complaining about the sudden cold draft. The walk to my SUV was crunching and silent. The aspen air was freezing, but my chest felt remarkably warm. For 8 years I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace for Terrence's sake. I had smiled through the passive-aggressive comments about my upbringing. I had politely ignored Geraldine when she bragged to her church friends about her successful daughter while pretending I did not exist. I had let Preston parade his average finance career around like he was a titan of industry. I let them believe I was just a lowly administrative assistant struggling to afford groceries. I buckled Layla into her car seat, wrapping a fleece blanket around her small shoulders. Miles climbed into his side, quiet and observant as always. Are we going home, Mom? He asked, his voice trembling slightly from the cold. No, sweetie, I told him, turning on the ignition and blasting the heat. We are going somewhere much better. I pulled out of the long, winding driveway of the estate. In the rearview mirror, I could see the glowing windows of the mansion, a beacon of luxury standing against the dark mountain sky. They were probably inside right now, toasting to my departure, claiming they had finally put me in my place. They thought they had won. They thought they had humiliated the poor girl who did not know how to appreciate fine things. I drove down the mountain roads, the snow falling gently against the windshield. The rhythmic hum of the heater lulled the children back to sleep within minutes. As the miles passed, the familiar sting of rejection completely vanished, replaced by a sharp, crystal-clear focus. I pulled into the heated underground parking garage of the Ritz-Carlton downtown. A valet immediately approached, opening my door with a respectful nod. I handed him the keys and gathered my sleeping children, guiding them up to the presidential suite I had secured just moments before on my phone. Once the kids were tucked into the massive cloud-like beds in the adjoining room, I walked out into the main living area of the suite. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the minibar and sat down on the plush velvet sofa. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out my iPad. The screen illuminated my face in the dark room. I tapped the secure application icon for Aura Estates. The biometric scanner read my face and granted me access to the master administrative dashboard. I was not an administrative assistant. I was the founder and chief executive officer of the most exclusive luxury property management firm in the state. I had built it from nothing, starting with one small rental property and scaling it into a multi-million-dollar empire while my in-laws were busy turning up their noses at me. I navigated to the current bookings tab and searched for Preston's name. There it was, the sprawling Aspen mansion they were currently occupying. Preston had spent the entire evening bragging about how his elite corporate connections had scored them the impossible reservation. He claimed he knew a guy who bypassed the 2-year waiting list. The truth was far more embarrassing for him. Preston had no connections. His application for the rental had actually been flagged and denied by my standard vetting team because his income-to-debt ratio was surprisingly poor. When I saw his name on the rejected list, I had personally intervened. I quietly approved the booking and comped the $20,000 a night fee using my executive override. I had gifted them the estate for the weekend, out of love for my husband, hoping it would finally bring our family together. They repaid that gift by throwing sleeping bags at my children. I stared at the active reservation on my screen. The power I held in my fingertips was absolute. They wanted to treat me like a peasant in my own castle. They wanted to flaunt their imaginary wealth while stepping on my neck. It was time to return them to reality. I tapped the master control menu for the property. 3 simple options appeared on the screen before me. I did not hesitate. I tapped the first button labeled Revoke Property Access. The digital locks on every door of the mansion instantly engaged, and the entry codes were wiped from the system. If any of them stepped outside, they would be locked out in the snow. Next, I tapped the button labeled Cancel Vendor Services. A notification popped up confirming that the private chef, the morning housekeeping team, and the premium grocery delivery service had all been canceled. The grand birthday gala catering scheduled for Saturday was officially voided. Finally, I scrolled down to the smart home integration panel. Preston had mocked me, saying I would not even know how to use the high-tech amenities. I smiled to myself as I tapped the environmental controls. I disabled the heated marble floors. I locked the smart sauna. And then, I turned off the central heating system, completely setting the entire house's climate control to shut down. A final prompt appeared on the screen asking me to verify these drastic changes. I tapped Confirm. The screen flashed green. Cancellation confirmed. I set the iPad down on the glass coffee table and leaned back into the sofa, taking a slow, deep breath. The floor of that mansion was going to get very cold tonight. The temperature inside the estate dropped steadily throughout the early morning hours, turning the structure into an icebox. By 6 a.m. on Friday, the bitter cold had seeped through the floorboards and crept into the vaulted ceilings. Geraldine pulled her silk robe tighter around her shoulders, her teeth chattering as she stepped out of the master bedroom. Her bare feet hit the marble floor, and she gasped. The previously heated tiles were now like blocks of ice, sending a shocking chill up her spine. She marched over to the thermostat mounted on the hallway wall, jabbing her finger against the screen with mounting frustration. The display remained blank. There was no hum from the vents, no familiar click of the furnace kicking into gear. The silence of the house was only broken by the howling wind, battering against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Geraldine rubbed her arms, her breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. She stomped toward the guest suite, throwing the heavy wooden door open to find her family. Vanessa was already awake, buried under a pile of down comforters. She held her smartphone high in the freezing air, waving it back and forth as if trying to catch a signal. "The Wi-Fi is dead," Vanessa complained, her voice nasal and whining in the quiet room. "I cannot even load my social media feed or check my messages. This is a disaster." Preston sat on the edge of the mattress, shivering in his silk pajamas. He tapped the screen of his phone, his face flushing red with irritation. He scoffed, tossing the blankets aside and standing up to face his shivering mother-in-law. "It is probably just a glitch with the smart home system," Preston said, running a hand through his messy hair while attempting to maintain his composure. "These luxury rentals always have premium concierge teams on standby for issues like this. I will just call the management company and have them send a technician out here right now. They will probably throw in a massage package to compensate us." He grabbed his platinum card from the nightstand, waving it like a weapon. I know exactly how to handle these people. You just have to apply aggressive corporate pressure. Preston dialed the premium concierge number listed on the welcome brochure. He paced the freezing bedroom, preparing his executive voice to demand immediate service. The line clicked, but instead of an apologetic live agent, a cold, automated recording played back to him. We are sorry, but the reservation associated with this number has been terminated. For unauthorized access issues, please vacate the premises immediately. Preston pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen in disbelief. He dialed the number again, pressing 0 repeatedly, demanding to speak to a senior manager. The same automated message looped endlessly in his ear. Geraldine wrapped her arms tighter around herself, glaring at her arrogant son-in-law with narrowing eyes. Do not just stand there holding a useless piece of plastic, she snapped angrily. Go directly to the kitchen and turn on the industrial gas stove. We can at least generate some residual heat and boil water for a hot pot of coffee. Preston marched down the hall into the gourmet kitchen, turning the heavy stainless steel knobs on the professional 6-burner range. There was no clicking sound. There was no spark to ignite the gas. The fuel line had been completely shut off from the main exterior valve. The three of them stood frozen in the silent kitchen, completely powerless. 20 miles down the winding mountain road, the bright morning sun streamed through the expansive glass windows of the Ritz-Carlton presidential suite. The thermostat hummed quietly at a perfect cozy 72 degrees. Sasha sat comfortably at a heavy mahogany dining table, wearing a plush white terry cloth robe provided by the hotel. She took a slow, satisfying sip of freshly brewed hazelnut coffee from a delicate porcelain cup. Across the long table, Miles and Layla were happily digging into towering stacks of warm buttermilk pancakes, thoroughly smothered in rich maple syrup and fresh mountain berries. A gleaming silver room service cart sat nearby, heavily laden with crisp bacon, fluffy scrambled eggs, and freshly squeezed orange juice. Soft instrumental jazz played gently from the sweet surround sound speakers, creating a perfectly serene atmosphere. Layla swung her little legs back and forth beneath the chair, her face happily sticky with sweet syrup. "This is the absolute best Thanksgiving ever," she said brightly, taking a massive bite of her warm breakfast. Sasha smiled genuinely, wiping her daughter's chin with a warm, damp cloth. "It certainly is," she agreed gently, savoring the absolute peace of the morning. Sasha's phone vibrated loudly on the mahogany table. She picked it up casually, glancing down at the glowing screen. It was a text message directly from Vanessa. The messages came through in rapid, panicked succession, a flurry of demanding, entitled complaints. "Mom is absolutely livid. The heating system is completely broken, and the entire house is freezing. The Wi-Fi is down, and the stove will not turn on. Get back here right now and figure out how to make us breakfast." Preston is absolutely furious. Sasha read the frantic messages twice, absorbing every desperate word. She did not feel a single ounce of guilt or hesitation. She looked over at her two beautiful children, entirely safe and perfectly warm, eating their luxurious breakfast without a care in the world. She clearly remembered the stark sight of the dusty, unwashed sleeping bags thrown carelessly onto the cold hardwood floor the night before. Sasha calmly typed her response with slow, deliberate keystrokes. She did not offer any explanations. She did not offer any apologies. She simply typed, "Should have booked a hotel. Enjoy the floor." She confidently hit send, placed the phone face down on the table, and picked up her coffee cup, letting the intense, comforting warmth soak deeply into her hands. I set my coffee cup down on the saucer and picked up my tablet again. While my children happily continued eating their warm breakfast in the luxurious comfort of the hotel suite, I opened the secure property management application for the Aspen estate. As the owner and CEO of Aura Estates, I had absolute access to the exterior and entryway camera feeds. I tapped the screen and brought up the live high-definition video with crystal-clear audio. I wanted a front-row seat to the exact moment their delusions of grandeur came crashing down. At precisely 7 in the morning, a sleek black SUV with the discreet gold Aura Estates logo pulled up the snowy driveway of the mansion. Two of my best local property managers, Marcus and Elena, stepped out. They were dressed in impeccable winter business attire, looking every bit the high-end professionals I trained them to be. I watched through the camera feed as Marcus confidently walked up the stone steps and pressed the doorbell. It took nearly 2 minutes for the heavy wooden door to open. Geraldine stood there looking absolutely miserable. She had layered a heavy wool blanket over her silk robe, her arms crossed tightly over her chest to preserve whatever body heat she had left. Her hair, usually perfectly styled for her church friends, was flat and disheveled. "Can I help you?" Geraldine snapped, her voice defensive and shivering. "We are dealing with a massive heating failure in this house, and the management company is completely ignoring our calls. You need to fix it immediately so my family can be comfortable." Marcus did not blink. He offered a polite, professional smile that I had trained all my executive staff to use when dealing with difficult clients. "Good morning, ma'am," Marcus said smoothly. "I am the regional director for Aura Estates. I am afraid there is no heating failure. We are here to officially inform you that the primary account holder canceled this reservation late last night. Your access to the property has been permanently revoked. You and your party have exactly 1 hour to collect your belongings and vacate the premises." Through the screen, I watched Geraldine's jaw drop. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. "You must be joking," she sputtered, her voice rising in panic. "We are not vacating anything. My son-in-law booked this estate through his elite corporate connections. There has simply been a misunderstanding. Do you have any idea who we are? We have 200 prestigious guests arriving tomorrow for a major gala event." Elena stepped forward, holding a sleek digital clipboard. "There is no misunderstanding, ma'am. The booking was officially voided in our system at 11 o'clock last night. The luxury catering team and event staff have also been notified of the cancellation. We are here to ensure a smooth departure. You now have 55 minutes to pack your things." Vanessa appeared in the entryway behind her mother, wrapped tightly in a thick down comforter. "What is going on?" Vanessa whined, her teeth audibly chattering. "Tell them to turn the heat back on, Mom. I cannot feel my toes and the Wi-Fi is still dead." "They are trying to kick us out!" Geraldine shrieked, turning to her daughter. "That ghetto girl Sasha must have hacked into their system when she left. She is doing this out of pure jealousy, because she cannot afford a place like this. Go get Preston right now. Tell him to handle these people." I smiled at the screen. Even now, shivering in the freezing cold, Geraldine's first instinct was to blame me and assume I was acting out of petty jealousy. She still believed she held the high ground. She still believed her son-in-law was the powerful savior who could fix everything with a snap of his fingers. Within seconds, Preston marched into the foyer. He was fully dressed in a designer winter coat, trying to project an air of absolute authority. He puffed out his chest, stepping in front of Geraldine and Vanessa to confront my property managers. He put on his best finance bro glare, the one he probably used to intimidate junior analysts at his firm. "Look here, buddy," Preston sneered, pointing a finger directly at Marcus. "I do not know what kind of rinky-dink operation you are running, but I am a senior wealth management broker. I manage portfolios that are worth more than your entire company. If there is a glitch in your little system, you are going to fix it right now. Turn the heat on and comp our entire stay for the inconvenience. Otherwise, I will have your job by noon." Marcus remained completely unbothered. He stood tall, looking at Preston with mild pity. "Sir, I assure you there is no glitch. The property has been cancelled. If you do not leave voluntarily within the hour, we will be forced to contact the local authorities to escort you off the private premises for trespassing." Preston scoffed loudly, a harsh, arrogant sound echoing in the entryway. He reached into his leather wallet and pulled out a heavy metal platinum credit card, practically shoving it into Marcus's chest. "You know what, I do not have time for this bureaucratic nonsense. I will just buy the place out for the weekend right now. I do not care what the daily rate is. Run the card, charge whatever you want. Put the entire weekend on my personal account and get out of my face." Geraldine let out a loud sigh of relief, patting Preston on the shoulder. "Thank you, Preston," she said smugly. "This is exactly why it is so important to have real money. See to it that these workers are dealt with properly." I leaned forward on my velvet sofa, my eyes glued to the tablet screen. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Marcus calmly pulled a mobile point-of-sale terminal from his jacket pocket. He took the heavy platinum card from Preston's hand. "I will attempt to process a new reservation for the weekend," Sir Marcus said, keeping his tone perfectly professional. "The total for a last-minute holiday booking will be $65,000. "Do it," Preston commanded, crossing his arms and looking down his nose at the staff. Marcus slid the platinum card into the digital reader. The machine processed for a few agonizingly long seconds. Then a loud, sharp beep echoed through the freezing foyer. The small screen on the terminal flashed bright red. Preston frowned, his arrogant posture faltering slightly. "What is the holdup? Your machine is probably frozen from the cold." "Run it again." Marcus looked down at the terminal, then looked directly into Preston's eyes. "I am sorry, sir, but the card has been completely declined." Preston went absolutely pale. The confident finance bro facade shattered in an instant. "That is impossible," he stammered, his voice suddenly pitching higher, losing all its previous authority. "Run it again. There is plenty of capital in that account. I just moved funds yesterday." Marcus shook his head, tapping the screen on his device. "The system is not just declining the charge due to insufficient funds, sir. The bank has placed a hard lock on this account. The terminal states the card was flagged for highly suspicious escrow activity. We cannot process any transactions with this card." Vanessa gasped, clutching her comforter tightly, her eyes wide with sudden fear. "Preston, what does he mean, suspicious escrow activity? What is going on with our money?" Preston looked like he was going to be physically sick. He began frantically patting his pockets, pulling out his phone to check his banking app, his hands shaking violently as he stared at his locked accounts. Geraldine stood frozen in horror, her eyes darting between the declined credit card and her suddenly panicking son-in-law. The realization that their golden boy might not be so golden was finally starting to dawn on her. Marcus handed the useless piece of metal back to Preston. "As I said, sir, you cannot buy the property for the weekend. The cancellation stands. You now have 45 minutes to leave the estate before I call the sheriff." I locked the screen of my tablet and set it down on the table, a deeply satisfied smile spreading across my face. The first domino had just fallen, and the great facade of Preston and Vanessa's wealthy life was about to collapse right on top of them. I watched the live feed on my tablet for another moment as Preston staggered backward. He looked completely hollowed out, staring at the useless piece of metal in his hands. Marcus and Elena stood like stone statues, offering absolutely no sympathy. The 45-minute countdown had officially begun. I tapped the screen and closed the security application. The silence in my hotel suite was a beautiful contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was erupting on that mountain. I walked over to the room service cart and poured myself a fresh mimosa. The crisp orange juice and cold champagne sparkled in the morning light. My phone resting on the mahogany dining table buzzed aggressively. The screen lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed Geraldine. I watched the screen glow, the phone vibrating against the wood. I did not reach for it. I simply took a slow sip of my drink. The phone stopped buzzing, went dark for exactly 2 seconds, and then lit up again. Geraldine was calling back. I leaned against the heavy velvet sofa and let it ring. I could perfectly picture the absolute panic setting in on her end. Geraldine was not just losing a free luxury vacation, she was losing her entire social standing. Tomorrow was Saturday. In exactly 24 hours, 200 of her most elite friends from her sorority and her church congregation were scheduled to arrive at that Aspen estate for her massive milestone 65th birthday gala. They were expecting a fully catered black tie affair with a live jazz band and premium open bar. She had spent the last 6 months bragging about the exclusive venue to anyone who would listen. Now she was standing in a freezing foyer being threatened with a police escort. My phone stopped ringing and instantly started again. She was relentless. By the time I finished my mimosa, the screen displayed 34 missed calls. I walked over to the table and flipped the phone face down, but the constant buzzing vibrated through the wood. I picked it up, hit the silent switch, and dropped it back onto the table. When I checked it 10 minutes later, the notification counter had climbed to 79 missed calls. 79 times Geraldine had desperately tried to reach the exact woman she had ordered to sleep on the floor just 8 hours prior. I knew exactly what was happening in that freezing mansion. With Preston utterly paralyzed by his declined credit card and locked bank accounts, Geraldine had to face the reality of the eviction alone. The property managers would not budge. They would watch with digital timers as my in-laws frantically shoved their designer clothes into their luxury suitcases. Geraldine would be calculating the social ruin that awaited her. She had no venue. She had no food. She had no way to host 200 high society guests. But admitting defeat or taking responsibility was completely outside Geraldine's nature. She needed a scapegoat to survive this humiliation. I opened my laptop to check my company emails, my mind easily visualizing the scene. Geraldine would never tell Vanessa and Preston the truth. She would never admit that the ghetto daughter-in-law she despised was actually the primary account holder of a luxury real estate firm. That truth would completely destroy the hierarchy she relied on to feel superior. Instead, she had to pivot. She had to create a lie that made me the villain and preserved her status as the victim. I imagined her pulling Vanessa and Preston aside in that icy driveway as they loaded their bags into the cold car. She would wipe away a dramatic tear, ensuring her voice carried the perfect pitch of a wronged matriarch. She would tell them that I was a vindictive, jealous woman who could not stand to see them happy. She would claim that because of my low-level administrative job, I must have figured out a way to illegally hack into the booking system and cancel the reservation just to ruin their weekend. She would spin a tale of my supposed jealousy over Preston's success and Vanessa's perfect marriage. She would convince them that I committed cybercrimes out of pure, unadulterated spite. It was the only narrative that would protect her fragile ego. If she painted me as a malicious hacker, it deflected all the blame away from Preston's declined card and her own lack of funds. It made them the innocent victims of an unhinged outsider. Vanessa, always eager to believe the absolute worst about me, would swallow the lie completely. She would wrap herself in her cashmere and complain about how I had always been unstable. Preston, desperate for any distraction from his frozen bank accounts and looming financial ruin, would eagerly agree. He needed an excuse for why his corporate connections had failed, and blaming a crazy sister-in-law was the perfect cover. I sat at the table and opened a fresh email from my chief financial officer. The subject line read, "Urgent suspicious wire attempts." The puzzle pieces were falling into place faster than I had anticipated. Geraldine was busy building her house of cards on a foundation of lies, completely unaware that a massive storm was about to blow it all away. She thought she could simply spin a fake story and control the narrative like she always did. But this time, I held the receipts. My children ran into the room, their faces bright and happy after finishing their breakfast. Miles grabbed his favorite toy car from his backpack and Layla climbed onto the sofa next to me. I stroked her hair, looking out the massive windows at the clear blue sky. My phone screen lit up one more time. It was not Geraldine. It was an international number. The caller ID displayed Terrence. Geraldine had not just lied to Vanessa and Preston. She had called my husband in London to feed him the exact same fabricated story. She was demanding that he control his wife. I stared at his name flashing on the screen. The ultimate test of our marriage was calling. I picked up the phone from the mahogany table and pressed answer. The connection from London was clear, but Terrence's voice was heavy with exhaustion and absolute panic. "Sasha, what in the world is going on over there?" he demanded immediately, not even bothering with a simple greeting. "My mother just called me in absolute hysterics." She says you completely lost your mind. Terence paced around his London hotel room while he relayed the absurd fabricated story Geraldine had just spun for him. She told him I threw a massive jealous tantrum because I simply could not handle being around their wealthy lifestyle. She claimed I packed up the kids in the middle of the night and stormed out like a raving lunatic, leaving them confused and worried. And the absolute worst part? Terence said, his voice rising in frantic disbelief. She is telling me that you somehow illegally hacked into the booking system of their luxury rental property to cancel their reservation and deliberately shut off their heat. Sasha. She is standing in the freezing Colorado snow, crying her eyes out and saying the local police are threatening to arrest them because of what you did. Please tell me she is exaggerating and that you did not do something so incredibly reckless. I sat perfectly still on the velvet sofa. My children were playing quietly with their toys on the thick hotel carpet nearby, completely oblivious to the vicious war being waged over them. I felt a deep, profound calm settle over my entire body. For 10 years, I had constantly defended myself against his mother's subtle passive-aggressive jabs and blatant manipulative lies. I had written lengthy, desperate text messages trying to explain my side of the story whenever she played the victim. I had cried genuine tears of frustration. I had begged Terence for years to finally see the truth about how his family treated me when he was not in the room. But sitting in that luxurious suite looking at my happy, safe children, I realized I was completely done defending my own existence to a man who always needed proof of my innocence. I did not hack into anything, Terence. I said, my voice steady, flat, and completely devoid of any defensive emotion. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aura Estates. It is my company. I personally own the luxury rental property your mother is currently being evicted from. I comped the $65,000 weekend as a secret gift to our family. Because I love you, and I wanted everyone to finally get along. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear his brain struggling to process the impossible information. Terence let out a confused, shaky breath. What are you talking about? Sasha, Aura Estates. You are an administrative assistant. How could you possibly own a multi-million-dollar luxury real estate firm? You are not making any sense right now. I completely ignored his disbelief and cut straight to the core of the horrific issue. Your mother did not tell you what actually happened when we arrived at the estate last night? I stated simply, letting the heavy truth hang in the air. She did not tell you that while she and Vanessa happily took the sprawling master suites and Preston drank expensive bourbon by the roaring fire, they pointed me toward a cold, empty, drafty hallway. They threw 2 dusty, unwashed sleeping bags onto the bare, freezing hardwood floor and told me that was exactly where your children and I would be sleeping for the holiday weekend. They told me I should be grateful for the privilege of simply sharing their oxygen. I heard a sharp intake of breath over the international line. Sasha, he whispered, his voice suddenly very small and stripped of all its previous accusatory anger. I did not let him interrupt or formulate an excuse. I packed up Layla and Miles and I walked right out the front door. I continued my tone absolute steel. I brought them to a warm, safe place where they would be treated like human beings instead of an unwanted inconvenience. And then I logged into my executive company system and I canceled their free reservation. I shut off the central heat. I locked the smart doors. I canceled the private chef and the housekeeping staff. Your mother desperately wanted me to know my place, and I decided I wanted her to intimately know hers. She wanted me to sleep on a freezing floor, Terence, so I gave them the floor. The line was completely silent, except for the faint digital static of the connection. I could hear Terence breathing heavily. I had laid all my hidden cards directly on the table. There were no more secrets to keep and absolutely no more compromises to make. For our entire marriage, Terence had cowardly straddled the fence, trying desperately to keep the fragile peace. He was always trying to appease his overbearing mother, while simultaneously pacifying me with empty promises that things would get better. He desperately wanted to believe the absolute best in his family, even when their terrible actions screamed otherwise. but he could no longer hide in the comfortable gray area of ignorance. I am not going to argue with you. Terrence and I am not going to fight your mother for your basic loyalty anymore, I told him calmly, looking out the massive window at the beautiful snow-covered mountain peaks. You have a monumental choice to make right now. You can choose to believe the awful, manipulative woman who gladly threw your small children on a freezing floor, or you can choose to believe your wife. I am not asking for mediation, and I am certainly not asking for a compromise. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide whose husband you are. I waited, holding my breath. The heavy silence stretched across the ocean, bridging the massive gap between London and Colorado. I listened closely, hoping to hear the righteous protective anger I desperately needed from the man I loved. I needed him to say he was absolutely furious at his mother for endangering our children. I needed him to say he was choosing us without a single moment of hesitation. I heard him let out a long, trembling breath. The faint, distant sound of traffic from the London streets drifted through the tiny phone speaker. "Sasha, please," he murmured, his voice thick with agonizing conflict. "She is still my mother. She is an older woman, and you left her stranded in the snow. You could have just booked a hotel and let it go. Why did you have to escalate things to this level?" And then there was a sharp, abrupt click. The line went completely dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared blankly at the dark screen. The call had forcefully disconnected. Terrence had actually hung up on me. My chest tightened instantly, and a sudden freezing dread washed over my entire body, chilling me down to the bone. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably as I slowly set the phone back down on the polished mahogany table. I looked over at Layla and Miles, who were still laughing and playfully racing their toy cars by the window, utterly protected from the brutal reality of the moment. I had just laid my entire marriage on the line, forcing him to make the ultimate choice, and Terrence had simply ended the call. My heart dropped heavily into my stomach as the horrifying realization permanently set in. He had chosen his mother. The neon sign of the Mountain View Motel buzzed with a harsh, flickering light, casting a sickly green glow over the cracked linoleum floor of the lobby. Geraldine sat rigidly on a faded floral sofa, clutching her designer handbag against her chest, as if the worn upholstery might somehow contaminate her. Around her, their expensive matched luggage was piled in a haphazard mountain, completely out of place in the dingy roadside reception area. The smell of stale coffee and industrial bleach hung heavily in the freezing air. Outside, the Colorado wind howled, sweeping snow across the empty parking lot. Vanessa paced back and forth in front of a buzzing vending machine, her winter boots squeaking loudly against the cheap floor. "I cannot believe that ungrateful woman actually did this," Vanessa complained, her voice echoing shrilly in the empty lobby. "She has completely lost her mind, Mom, hacking into a corporate database just to throw us out in the snow. Terrence needs to have her committed immediately. She is a certified psychopath and a criminal." Geraldine nodded furiously, her lips pressed into a tight, thin line. "I warned him, Vanessa. I warned your brother from the very beginning that bringing someone from the South Side into our family would end in absolute disaster. She has always been deeply jealous of us and our lifestyle. She saw my milestone birthday gala as a threat because she knows she will never belong in our social circle. She obviously orchestrated this entire cyber attack purely out of spite to humiliate me in front of my church friends and the country club ladies. She thinks she can ruin my special day just because she has no class." A few feet away, Preston was entirely ignoring their venomous rant. His face was slick with a cold sweat despite the drafty lobby. He stood with his back to them, hunched over his smartphone, his thumb frantically tapping the screen as he dialed his bank for the 5th time in 20 minutes. His usually perfectly styled hair was plastered to his forehead and his hands were visibly shaking. "I need to speak to the fraud department right now," Preston hissed into the phone, his voice trembling with barely contained panic. "I have corporate accounts that are completely frozen, and this makes absolutely no sense. Do not put me on hold again. I am a senior wealth management broker, and I demand to know why my assets are locked. I need to speak to a supervisor immediately. Geraldine rolled her eyes at her son-in-law's frantic behavior. Preston, stop yelling at those incompetent customer service workers, she instructed, adjusting her silk scarf with forced dignity. Your accounts are locked because that spiteful girl obviously compromised your financial data when she hacked the estate booking system. She probably stole your information out of pure jealousy. We will have the authorities deal with her computer crimes on Monday. Right now, we have a much more pressing emergency to handle. She pulled her smartphone from her handbag, her manicured fingers tapping the screen with intense determination. I am not going to let that miserable administrative assistant ruin my 65th birthday, Geraldine announced, lifting her chin with haughty pride. I have 200 elite guests arriving in Aspen tomorrow afternoon. They have booked flights and luxury hotels based solely on my exclusive invitation. I will simply secure the main ballroom at the local country club and have the catering team meet us there instead. We do not need her stolen luxury rental to host a magnificent event. I will show her exactly how a real woman of means handles a crisis. Geraldine dialed the direct emergency line for Alpine Elite Catering. She had spent 6 months selecting them specifically because they were the most exclusive and expensive culinary service in the state. The line rang twice before the head event coordinator answered. "This is Geraldine," she announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and expected authority. "We have had a slight complication with the venue for tomorrow evening's gala. The estate had a catastrophic plumbing issue, so we will be moving the event to the Aspen Country Club ballroom. I need your team to redirect the delivery and set up to the new address immediately." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Geraldine tapped her foot impatiently against the linoleum. "I am very sorry, Mom," the coordinator finally said, his tone perfectly professional, but completely devoid of warmth. "We cannot redirect the event setup because your catering contract has been officially terminated." Geraldine gasped, gripping the phone tighter. "Terminated? What are you talking about? I have 200 highly influential guests expecting a 5-course black tie dinner tomorrow. You cannot terminate my event at the last minute." The coordinator sighed softly over the line. "Mom, the entire invoice for your custom menu, the premium open bar, the waitstaff, and the live band was being completely sponsored and covered by Aura Estates. When the regional director of the property management firm contacted us this morning to officially void the venue reservation, they also withdrew their financial sponsorship for the catering contract. Since Aura Estates was footing the entire bill, their cancellation completely nullifies our services." Geraldine's chest tightened painfully. Her breath caught in her throat as the horrifying reality of the coordinator's words washed over her. Aura Estates, the company Sasha claimed to work for, the company Sasha apparently hacked. They had been paying for her magnificent gala. They had funded the entire thing. "There must be a mistake," Geraldine stammered, her voice losing all its haughty edge and dropping to a desperate whisper. "I am the guest of honor. The contract is in my name." "Your name was on the customized menus, Mom," the coordinator corrected coldly. "But Aura Estates was the primary financial guarantor. If you wish to reinstate the event and proceed with the new venue tomorrow, we can certainly accommodate you. However, since the corporate sponsor has pulled out, you will need to cover the outstanding balance yourself. The total for the event is $45,000. We would need that paid in full upfront today before we begin any preparations." Geraldine stood absolutely frozen in the middle of the cheap motel lobby. $45,000. She could easily provide the payment over the phone, the coordinator offered helpfully. "We accept all major credit cards and wire transfers." Geraldine's hand began to shake violently. Vanessa stopped pacing and looked over at her mother, expecting her to effortlessly handle the minor inconvenience. Preston was still arguing loudly with the fraud department in the corner, completely unaware of the new disaster unfolding before them. Geraldine opened her designer handbag and looked down at her matching leather wallet. She had spent the last decade parading around country clubs bragging about her investments and turning her nose up at anyone she deemed beneath her. She had constantly belittled Sasha for being poor and uncultured. She had demanded absolute respect based on an elaborate illusion of immense wealth. But as she stared into the dark depths of her expensive purse, the crushing, suffocating truth finally cornered her. There was no hidden fortune. There was no massive investment portfolio or endless trust fund. The designer bags and the expensive shoes were all bought on credit cards that were currently pushed to their absolute maximum limits. She lived month to month on a modest pension and whatever she could guilt Terrence into sending her under the guise of household repairs. She did not have $45,000. She did not even have $4,000 to her name. The entire gala, the estate, the food, the luxury had all been a phantom gift from the exact woman she had tried to force onto the floor. "I will have to call you back," Geraldine whispered, her voice barely a dry, hollow croak. She hung up the phone and let it slowly drop to her side. The buzzing neon sign of the motel seemed to mock her as she stood amidst the cheap linoleum and the smell of bleach. The grand illusion she had spent her entire life desperately maintaining was completely shattered. She was not a wealthy matriarch hosting high society galas. She was a broke, desperate woman standing in a roadside motel without a dime to her name, and tomorrow 200 of her most elite friends were going to find out the absolute truth. I sat in the quiet comfort of my hotel suite watching the thick snow fall gently against the floor-to-ceiling glass. The warmth of the room wrapped around me like a protective blanket, a sharp contrast to the freezing mountain air outside. Layla and Miles had moved on to watching a cartoon on the large television, completely unaware of the absolute devastation that had just fractured my husband's family. I took a deep, slow breath, letting the profound silence wash over me. My phone rested on the heavy mahogany table beside my empty mimosa glass. It was quiet now. Terrence had not called back. He had made his choice, and the finality of that click still echoed in my mind. Geraldine had also stopped her frantic dialing. The silence from their end meant they had finally hit the brick wall of reality in whatever cheap motel they had managed to find. The sudden vibration of my phone startled me slightly, but it was not a Colorado number or an international call from London. The screen displayed the name David, my chief financial officer, at Ara Estates. David rarely called me on a weekend, unless it was an absolute emergency, regarding one of our elite properties or a major corporate issue. I picked up the phone and accepted the call, keeping my voice low and steady so I would not disturb the children. David did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. He told me he had been actively monitoring the system alerts since I manually triggered the eviction protocol at the Aspen property earlier that morning. He explained that our corporate security software had flagged a series of highly suspicious financial activities linked directly to the canceled reservation under Geraldine's name. I walked over to the window, looking out at the pristine white snow as he detailed the desperate digital scramble taking place on Preston's end. According to David, Preston had logged into the guest payment portal just moments after the eviction notice was served by the property managers. He had frantically tried to pay the outstanding balance to reinstate the booking and save the weekend. David tracked the keystrokes and the failed attempts. Preston had run 6 different high-limit credit cards in the span of 10 minutes. Every single one of them had been instantly declined for insufficient funds or flagged for exceeding maximum limits. Preston and Vanessa were completely maxed out. The wealthy, successful image they projected to the world, the designer clothes and the luxury cars, was nothing but an empty shell built on massive, suffocating consumer debt. But that was not the reason David had called me on a Saturday morning. The declined credit cards were just pathetic and embarrassing. What happened next was strictly criminal. David explained that after the credit cards failed, Preston had attempted to bypass the standard automated payment gateway. He tried to initiate a direct wire transfer for the full $65,000 to cover the luxury weekend and the massive catering invoice. Our payment processing system requires rigorous identity verification for large wire transfers to prevent money laundering and fraud. The system automatically cross-referenced the routing numbers Preston hurriedly entered into the portal. I stood perfectly still as David delivered the crushing blow. The routing and account numbers Preston used did not belong to him. They did not belong to Vanessa. They did not belong to any personal or joint account associated with their names or their home address. The numbers traced directly back to the corporate holding accounts at Preston's wealth management firm. Specifically, David noted they were tied to private trust funds belonging to Preston's high-net-worth clients. I felt the breath leave my lungs as the sheer magnitude of what David was saying settled over me. Preston was not just broke. He was actively embezzling money from his own clients. He was so incredibly desperate to maintain the facade of his immense wealth, so terrified of Vanessa finding out the truth, and Geraldine throwing a massive social fit that he was willing to commit federal wire fraud right from the icy driveway of my property. He was literally trying to steal $65,000 from an elderly client's trust fund just to pay for a luxury vacation and a catered birthday party. The puzzle pieces slammed together in my mind, creating a crystal-clear picture of the absolute rot at the core of their entire family. For years, the math had never made sense to me. Preston was a mid-level broker, but the sheer volume of their spending was astronomical. The custom-tailored suits, the imported vehicles, the sprawling house in the best neighborhood. The constant flow of designer bags, Vanessa paraded at every single family gathering. They treated me like absolute garbage because I worked an administrative job while they supposedly lived in the upper echelons of elite society. Preston had constantly looked down his nose at me, making subtle racist remarks about my background and implying I was only with Terrence for financial stability. All this time, the arrogant, wealthy brother-in-law, who treated me like a ghetto charity case, was nothing but a common thief wearing an expensive suit. He was stealing from innocent people to fund Vanessa's ridiculous lifestyle and keep Geraldine happy. The pure, unadulterated hypocrisy of it all was staggering. They thought they were better than me, but their entire existence was a criminal lie built on stolen money. I asked David if the wire transfer had actually gone through. He assured me that our financial compliance system had blocked the transaction, immediately flagging it as potential severe fraud. The client's money was safe, but the digital footprint of Preston's desperate attempt was permanently logged in our secure corporate servers. He had left a clear, undeniable trail of his desperate crime. I told David to pull every single data log associated with the transaction. I needed the IP address, the timestamps, the routing numbers, and the exact account details Preston had entered into the portal. I needed unquestionable documented proof. David promised to compile the raw data and send it to my encrypted corporate email within the hour. I hung up the phone and walked over to my laptop, opening it on the smooth dining table. My hands were completely steady, and my mind was incredibly clear. I was no longer just the scapegoat daughter-in-law trying to protect herself from petty family gossip. I was holding the absolute key to their complete destruction. Geraldine was currently sitting in some cheap roadside motel trying to spin a fabricated story about me being a malicious hacker to save her own skin. She was probably telling Vanessa and Preston right now that I was a cybercriminal who deserved to be locked up. An email notification chimed softly from my laptop speakers. The subject line read, "Requested security logs confidential." I opened the message and downloaded the attached PDF files directly to my desktop. I opened the document and stared at the lines of raw data. There it was, in black and white. Preston's name, his digital signature, the exact moment he tried to steal client funds to pay my company. I dragged the files into a secure new folder on my desktop and named it The Arsenal. Geraldine thought she could control the narrative by playing the victim and making me the villain. She thought she could lie to my husband and destroy my marriage to protect her own fragile ego. But she had no idea what was actually happening right under her nose. She had no idea that her perfect son-in-law was facing federal prison. And she had absolutely no idea that the woman she had ordered to sleep on the bare floor now held the power to obliterate their entire world with a single simple phone call to the authorities. The digital file sat securely on my desktop, a ticking time bomb waiting for the exact right moment to detonate. I closed my laptop and let out a long, slow breath. It was Saturday afternoon. The day of Geraldine's magnificent milestone gala had officially arrived, but the reality she was facing was a complete disaster. I knew her playbook perfectly. Admitting defeat was simply not an option for a woman whose entire identity was wrapped in the fragile opinions of her elite social circles. She could never stand before her church congregation and her sorority sisters and confess that she was completely broke. Instead, she had to construct another massive lie to cover up her financial ruin. My phone buzzed with a forwarded message from a mutual family acquaintance. It was a mass text from Geraldine sent to all 200 of her guests. The message was an absolute masterpiece of manufactured tragedy. She wrote that a catastrophic pipe burst had completely flooded the main ballroom of the luxury Aspen estate, making it impossible to safely host the gala. She claimed the property managers were absolutely devastated and had offered her a full refund, but the damage was already done. With incredibly short notice, she wrote she was forced to relocate the black tie event to save the evening. She directed all 200 high society guests who had packed designer evening gowns and rented expensive luxury vehicles to redirect their navigation apps to a mid-tier chain steakhouse on the edge of town. It was the kind of restaurant known for cheap happy hour specials and sticky laminated menus, not five-course catered dinners and live jazz bands. I could perfectly picture the absolute chaos that was about to unfold. 200 wealthy, judgmental women arriving at a dim, crowded steakhouse, expecting premium champagne, and being handed an oversized plastic pager that buzzed when their table was ready. Geraldine was leading her elite friends directly into a social slaughterhouse, all because she refused to admit she could not afford the life she pretended to live. While Geraldine was busy trying to desperately staple her crumbling lies together, I was preparing to step out of the shadows. For 10 years, I had dressed down around my in-laws. I had deliberately worn plain clothes and kept my hair simple just to avoid triggering Vanessa's intense jealousy and Geraldine's snide remarks. I had made myself physically small so they could feel big. That version of Sasha was officially dead. I walked into the massive marble bathroom of my hotel suite and took a long hot shower. The steam filled the room, melting away any lingering stress from the morning. When I stepped out, I did not reach for the casual jeans and oversized sweaters I usually wore around them. Instead, I opened my garment bag and pulled out the custom-tailored charcoal gray power suit I typically reserved for closing massive commercial real estate acquisitions. The silk lining slipped over my skin, and the sharp, structured lines of the blazer fit my shoulders perfectly. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and my favorite pointed toe heels. I pinned my hair back in a sleek, elegant style and applied my makeup with absolute precision. When I looked in the full-length mirror, I did not see the timid ghetto daughter-in-law they constantly belittled. I saw the chief executive officer of Aura Estates. I saw a woman who had built an empire from the ground up while her husband's family drowned in their own pretentious debt. I saw a woman who held the absolute power to destroy them. I kissed Layla and Miles on their foreheads, leaving them in the capable hands of the luxury hotel's certified nanny service. They were happily watching movies and eating room service, completely sheltered from the storm. I grabbed my keys and my phone, securely holding the downloaded digital evidence of Preston's federal wire fraud. The cold Colorado air hit my face as I stepped out of the opulent lobby, but I did not shiver. The heat of absolute vindication kept me completely warm. I climbed into the driver's seat of my rented luxury SUV and started the engine. The drive to the steakhouse took exactly 20 minutes. The mountain roads were slick with melting snow, but my hands were completely steady on the leather steering wheel. I drove past the beautiful snow-covered pines, my mind visualizing the exact sequence of events that was about to occur. Geraldine thought the worst part of her day was moving her black tie gala to a cheap restaurant. She had no idea that a massive storm was speeding directly toward her. I pulled into the crowded parking lot of the steakhouse and parked my vehicle near the back, observing the absolute wreckage of Geraldine's social standing. Luxury sedans and town cars were crammed into tiny parking spaces next to muddy pickup trucks. Women shivering in expensive floor-length evening gowns and heavy fur coats were standing awkwardly on the cracked sidewalk, looking utterly confused as they stared at the glowing neon sign of the mid-tier chain restaurant. They were whispering behind their hands, their faces twisted in a mixture of pity and severe judgment as they navigated the slushy pavement in their designer heels. I did not turn off the engine, and I did not get out of my car. I was not there to attend a pathetic, ruined birthday party. I was not there to walk inside the greasy establishment and endure Geraldine's desperate attempts to save face in front of her judgmental friends. I sat comfortably in the heated leather seat of my vehicle, watching the overdressed guests shuffle through the double-glass doors into the crowded, chaotic lobby. The smell of fried food and cheap beer practically wafted across the parking lot. I checked the time on my digital dashboard display. I was precisely on schedule. I rolled down my window slightly, letting the crisp evening air fill the cabin as I waited in the shadows of the parking lot. I watched Vanessa and Preston hurriedly usher an elderly woman inside, trying to shield her from the freezing wind. Preston still looked completely panicked, constantly checking his phone, while Vanessa clutched her cashmere wrap with a look of pure mortification. I let out a soft laugh. I was not there to watch Geraldine's humiliating dinner. I was there to meet someone outside in the freezing parking lot. Someone who was going to take the digital evidence I currently held and turn Preston's arrogant life completely upside down. A yellow taxicab pulled up next to my rented luxury vehicle, cutting through the slush and snow of the crowded steakhouse parking lot. The back door opened, and Terrence stepped out into the freezing Colorado air. He looked completely exhausted, his winter coat thrown hastily over his travel-wrinkled clothes. He had not chosen his mother. When he hung up the phone in London, he had immediately packed his bags and rushed to the airport to catch the first red-eye flight back to the States. My heart swelled as I watched him open the other side of the cab to help Layla and Miles step out onto the pavement. He had gone straight to the hotel suite first to gather our children from the nanny before coming to find me. I opened my car door and stepped out into the biting wind. Terrence saw me and immediately wrapped his arms around me, pulling the kids in for a massive, tight family embrace. "I am so sorry I was not there to protect you," he whispered into my hair, his voice full of genuine regret and exhaustion. "I am so sorry I ever doubted you, Sasha." I held on to my husband and my children, feeling the final fractured pieces of my heart completely heal. Terrence had finally stepped off the fence. He had made his choice, and he had chosen us. He pulled back slightly and looked me directly in the eyes. He told me that during his long layover in New York, he had opened the encrypted corporate email I sent him. He had seen the digital wire logs and the undeniable proof that his own brother was committing federal fraud to fund their mother's massive lies. He said that was the exact moment his blind loyalty to his family had permanently died. He finally saw them for the toxic, manipulative parasites they truly were. But Terrence had not just flown across the world to apologize and hold my hand. He turned back toward the idling taxicab and nodded. The front passenger door opened, and an older gentleman in an impeccable wool overcoat stepped out onto the slushy pavement. It was Mr. Harrington, the senior managing partner at Preston's elite wealth management firm. Terrence had not just looked at the wire fraud logs. He had immediately forwarded them to Preston's boss and demanded he meet them in Colorado to see the absolute disaster unfolding in person. Mr. Harrington looked around the dingy steakhouse parking lot with an expression of pure disgust. He walked over to us, his face hard and unreadable. Terrence introduced us quickly, but there was no time for polite small talk. Mr. Harrington demanded to see the raw data files I had downloaded from the Aura Estates server. I handed him my tablet and watched his eyes scan the glowing screen. I saw the exact moment his professional composure shattered. He saw the routing numbers that belonged directly to the private trust funds of his most vulnerable, elderly clients. He saw Preston's digital signature and the desperate attempts to steal $65,000 just to save face at a birthday party. Mr. Harrington handed the tablet back to me and let out a heavy, furious breath. He told me that Preston had been under internal review for weeks due to suspicious expense reports, but they never imagined he was actively embezzling client funds to maintain a fake high society lifestyle. The managing partner looked toward the glowing neon sign of the steakhouse where Preston was currently hiding. Mr. Harrington did not say another word to us. He simply pulled his phone from his coat pocket and dialed the local police department. We stood in the freezing parking lot together, a unified front against the decades of manipulation and abuse. Inside that cheap restaurant, Geraldine was desperately trying to force 200 wealthy women to eat discount steaks, while Preston sweated through his designer suit, entirely unaware that his boss was standing 50 feet away, finalizing his criminal arrest. Vanessa was probably complaining about the lack of premium champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that her luxury lifestyle was about to evaporate into thin air. They were all trapped in a cage of their own making, and the key had just been thrown away. Terrence held my hand tightly as the distant wail of police sirens began to echo through the mountain valley. The sound grew louder, piercing the quiet winter night. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the snow-covered pines as 3 squad cars aggressively pulled into the steakhouse parking lot. They parked directly in front of the glass doors, blocking any possible escape. My husband stood tall and resolute beside me, entirely ready to watch the house of cards collapse. He squeezed my fingers, letting me know that we were finally in this together. The ultimate test of our marriage was over, and we had won. The red and blue lights painted the snow-covered parking lot, but we did not wait for the officers to walk in first. Mr. Harrington had spoken to the lead officer, and they agreed to let us secure the target before making a public arrest in a crowded restaurant. Terrence kept his hand wrapped firmly around mine as we walked past the idling squad cars. The freezing wind whipped at my coat, but I could only feel the heat of the moment. We pushed through the heavy glass double doors of the steakhouse, and the smell of cheap frying oil and spilled beer hit us immediately. The lobby was packed with annoyed regular customers waiting for tables, but my eyes instantly found the back dining area. Geraldine had managed to bully the management into pushing several large tables together right in the middle of the dining room floor. Even from 50 feet away, over the noise of the crowded restaurant, I could hear my mother-in-law's voice carrying through the room. She was holding court perfectly in her element, playing the ultimate tragic victim. She sat next to her pastor and several women draped in expensive furs who looked incredibly uncomfortable sitting in sticky vinyl booths. Geraldine was wiping away fake tears with a cheap paper napkin. I heard her clear as day. She was telling the pastor that her son Terrence had been brainwashed by a malicious ghetto woman. She spun a masterful lie, claiming that I had purposely sabotaged her beautiful birthday gala out of pure spite and jealousy. She told her wealthy sorority sisters that I was a dangerous cybercriminal who had hacked into the luxury resort's computer system to cancel their reservation just to humiliate the family. She painted herself as a generous, loving mother who had tried so hard to accept her son's lower-class wife only to be stabbed in the back on her milestone birthday. Vanessa was sitting next to her, nodding along and sipping a bright blue cocktail through a neon straw, while Preston kept wiping sweat from his forehead and checking his phone. Terrence tightened his grip on my hand. I could feel the absolute rage radiating from his body. He had spent his entire life making excuses for his mother's dramatic behavior, but hearing her publicly assassinate my character while sitting next to the son who was actively stealing from elderly clients was the final breaking point. We walked past the hostess stand, ignoring the waitress who tried to ask how many were in our party. Mr. Harrington walked one step behind us, his face set in a mask of professional fury. My high heels clicked loudly against the sticky linoleum floor. We walked straight into the main dining area, heading directly for their massive table. One by one, the elite guests began to notice us. The wealthy women in their evening gowns stopped whispering. The pastor looked up from his plate. Vanessa lowered her bright blue drink. Preston finally looked up from his phone and all the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a designer suit. Geraldine had her back to us. She was still talking, still spinning her web of lies. She was just saying how she prayed for my soul and hoped Terrence would finally wake up and divorce me. The words hung in the stale restaurant air. Then she noticed that nobody at the table was looking at her anymore. The entire group of 200 guests was staring past her shoulder. The ambient noise of the steakhouse seemed to drop to a dead silence. The clinking of silverware stopped. The forced laughter died. Geraldine turned around slowly in her vinyl booth. Her eyes traveled up the sharp lines of my custom-tailored power suit and then shifted to the man holding my hand. She let out a sharp gasp. She had expected me to be hundreds of miles away crying in a hotel room. She certainly had not expected her golden son to be standing next to me. Terrence was supposed to be in London, completely oblivious to the chaos she had caused. The look of pure, unadulterated shock on Geraldine's face was something I will remember for the rest of my life. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked at Terrence, expecting to see the compliant, obedient son who always rushed to her defense. Instead, she saw a man looking at her with absolute disgust. Terrence did not let go of my hand. He stood tall in his wrinkled travel clothes and stared down at his mother. Preston had barely processed Terrence's arrival before his eyes landed on the older gentleman standing directly behind us. Preston made a pathetic, choking sound. He actually pushed himself back against the booth as if he could somehow escape through the brick wall. Mr. Harrington did not say a single word to Geraldine or Vanessa. He simply stared at Preston with the cold, calculating eyes of a man who was about to dismantle a life. "Hello, Mother," Terrence said, his voice incredibly low and calm, but carrying enough weight to make the surrounding tables fall completely silent. Geraldine tried to recover her fake smile. She stumbled over her words, saying, "Terrence, my sweet boy, what are you doing here? You are supposed to be in Europe." She actually tried to reach her hand out across the table toward him. Terrence took a deliberate step back, pulling me with him. He looked at the pastor and then at the wealthy sorority women who were watching this train wreck unfold. He told his mother that he flew back because he finally realized his wife needed protection from her own family. The entire table gasped collectively. Geraldine tried to play the victim again immediately, launching into her fabricated story about how I had hacked the resort and ruined her special day. She pointed a shaking finger at me, calling me a liar and a thief. I did not say a single word. I did not need to defend myself. Terrence looked at his mother and told her to stop talking. He told her that her special day was not ruined by a pipe burst or a malicious hack. It was ruined because she was completely broke, and her favorite son-in-law was a desperate criminal. Vanessa let out a loud, offended shriek, demanding to know what Terrence was talking about. She looked at Preston, expecting him to defend their honor and put us in our place. But Preston could not speak. His eyes were locked on Mr. Harrington, and he was visibly trembling, shaking so badly that his expensive watch rattled against the wooden table. The arrogant, wealthy brother-in-law who had treated me like garbage for years was now reduced to a terrified, sweating mess in the middle of a cheap steakhouse. Mr. Harrington finally stepped forward. He looked down at Preston and told him that corporate security had logged every single keystroke from his laptop that morning. He told him that the firm was completely aware of his attempt to wire $65,000 from the client trust accounts to pay for a birthday party. The gasps from the elite guests around the table were deafening. Vanessa dropped her cocktail glass, spilling blue liquid all over the table as she stared at her husband in absolute horror. Geraldine tried to speak, tried to spin one more lie to save her crumbling social empire, but the words completely failed her. She looked at me standing there in my power suit, holding her son's hand, and she finally realized the absolute magnitude of her mistake. She had poked a bear for years, assuming it would never bite back, and now the jaws were snapping shut around her entire life. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the table from the front lobby. The police officers had finally walked in. The police officers stepped into the dining room, their heavy boots thudding against the sticky floor. Before they could even pull out their badges or address Preston directly, Geraldine leaped up from her vinyl booth. Her face was completely flushed with desperate, furious rage. She refused to accept that her perfectly constructed world was crashing down around her. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me, trying to seize control of the narrative one last time before the handcuffs came out. "How dare you show your face here?" she screamed, her voice echoing off the cheap wood-paneled walls of the steakhouse. "You malicious, spiteful little girl!" Vanessa immediately sneered, standing up next to her mother and crossing her arms defensively. She looked at me with absolute contempt, trying to act superior, even as her own husband sat trembling and sweating beside her. "Look at her!" Vanessa scoffed loudly enough for the entire room of wealthy guests to hear. "She brings the police to our mother's birthday dinner just because she is intensely jealous that she will never belong in our world. You are pathetic, Sasha. You are just trying to ruin this night because you have nothing of value in your own miserable life. You have always been a massive disappointment to this family, and you will never be anything more than a common administrative assistant." Near the center of the pushed-together dining tables, the restaurant management had set up a small, makeshift stage with a microphone. It was meant for the terrible local jazz band that Geraldine had hastily hired to try and replicate the elegant atmosphere of her ruined gala. I looked at the microphone and knew exactly what I needed to do. I let go of Terrence's hand. He gave me a firm, proud nod of encouragement, stepping back to let me handle the family that had tormented me for a decade. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Mr. Harrington, watching the scene unfold with quiet validation. I walked past the confused police officers, past the staring elite guests, and past Vanessa, who instinctively took a nervous step backward as I approached. Her fake bravery faltered when she saw the absolute certainty in my eyes. I stepped onto the small wooden platform and grabbed the cold metal microphone. I looked directly down at my mother-in-law, watching her chest heave with indignant anger. She was still trying to look down her nose at me, even though her mascara was smudged and her rented dress was wrinkled from the stressful day. "I came to give you your birthday gift, Geraldine," I said, my voice amplifying through the cheap restaurant speakers, perfectly calm and perfectly steady. The truth. The entire dining room fell completely dead silent. You could hear a pin drop in the crowded steakhouse. The clatter of silverware and the low hum of background conversation vanished completely. I looked around at the 200 high society women, the pastors, the country club socialites, and the wealthy friends Geraldine had spent her entire life trying to impress. I told the room exactly who I was. I told them that the ghetto daughter-in-law they had spent the last hour gossiping about was not a struggling administrative assistant working a dead-end corporate job. I announced clearly and proudly that I was the founder and chief executive officer of Aura Estates. I told them that Aura Estates was the exact luxury property management company that owned the breathtaking Aspen mansion they were originally supposed to be dining in tonight. The gasps from the audience were immediate and incredibly satisfying. Wealthy women in their fur coats covered their mouths in absolute shock. The pastor sitting next to Geraldine slowly lowered his water glass, his eyes wide with stunned realization. Geraldine shook her head violently, refusing to believe it. She called me a pathological liar, claiming I was just making up ridiculous stories to embarrass her in front of her friends because I was bitter and poor. She yelled that I was having a mental breakdown and begged the police to arrest me for trespassing. I did not argue with her. I calmly pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my master digital portfolio. I tapped the screen and held it up high for her, Vanessa, and the entire front row of guests to see. It was the official property deed for the $30 million Aspen estate, perfectly legal and bearing my full name as the sole corporate owner. I looked right into Geraldine's horrified eyes and told her that there was no pipe burst at the mansion today. I explained that I had personally initiated the automated eviction protocol because she had treated my luxury property and my hardworking staff like absolute garbage. I told her that I was the one who locked her out in the freezing snow because I refused to let her disrespect my empire for one more second. I told her that the moment she demanded I sleep on the floor of my own house was the exact moment I decided to end her reign of terror. But I was not finished. I looked over at Vanessa, who was now staring at my phone with her jaw hanging wide open, all the arrogant color completely drained from her face. Her eyes darted back and forth between the digital deed and my face, unable to process the enormous reality of her own stupidity. I turned back to the microphone and decided to lay all their darkest financial secrets completely bare for the entire world to see. I told the silent, captivated audience that Aura Estates did not just own the Aspen property. We owned the luxury villa in Cabo San Lucas where the family spent last Christmas. We owned the massive penthouse suite in Dubai they visited 2 years ago. We owned the sprawling beachfront estate in the Maldives where Geraldine celebrated her 60th birthday. I watched the absolute devastation wash over my in-laws' faces as I explained the harsh reality of their fake existence. I told the crowd that for the past 5 years, every single extravagant international family vacation, every private chef, every luxury yacht rental, every top-tier experience they loudly bragged about to their elite circles had been completely funded and subsidized by me. I had secretly provided my exclusive corporate discount and paid the massive remaining balances out of my own personal pocket just to keep the peace and make my husband happy. I had literally bankrolled their entire high society lifestyle while they mocked my cheap clothes and treated me like a peasant. Geraldine physically staggered backward, her knees giving out as she fell hard into the sticky vinyl booth. The wealthy women she had spent decades trying to impress were now looking at her with absolute pity and total revulsion. They finally understood that the woman who constantly bragged about her immense wealth and flawless taste was actually surviving on the secret charity of the daughter-in-law she openly despised and humiliated. The fake crown she wore had been completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Then I pointed directly toward Preston, who was currently hyperventilating under the harsh restaurant lights. I told the room that while I was quietly funding their luxury vacations, the golden son-in-law was secretly drowning in massive consumer debt just to buy Vanessa her designer handbags. I explained that Preston was so desperately broke and so terrified of maintaining his fake image today that he had literally attempted to wire $65,000 from an elderly client's private trust fund to pay for this exact birthday party. I told them that Mr. Harrington, his boss, was standing right by the door with the digital proof and was entirely ready to press federal charges. The police officers, who had been waiting patiently, finally stepped forward, moving directly past the shocked wealthy guests and zeroing in on Preston. Vanessa began to sob hysterically, realizing her entire world of luxury and status was completely fake and her husband was going to federal prison. Geraldine sat frozen in the booth, completely destroyed by the undeniable truth of her own pathetic reality. I placed the microphone back on its stand, the quiet thud echoing through the room. I walked off the stage feeling lighter and more powerful than I ever had in my entire life, leaving them to drown in the absolute wreckage of their own lies. We had barely made it halfway across the freezing slush of the steakhouse parking lot when the heavy glass doors of the restaurant banged open behind us. The sharp, frantic clatter of high heels echoed in the cold mountain air. She was running completely unhinged, ignoring the biting winter wind that whipped her thin, rented dress around her legs. "Terrence!" I heard her shriek, her voice cracking with a level of pure panic I had never heard from her before. "Terrence, please wait. You have to stop." She caught up to us near our luxury rental car, gasping for breath and stumbling in the snow. The grand matriarch of the family was entirely unrecognizable. Her expensive facade had completely melted away, leaving nothing but a desperate, terrified woman. Through the large glass windows of the restaurant, I could still see the last of her elite friends hurrying into their own vehicles, keeping their heads down to avoid making any eye contact with her. The whispers were already spreading like wildfire through the country club group chats. Her carefully curated social standing, the absolute most important thing in her entire life, had just been incinerated in front of her pastor and her closest sorority sisters. She was a social pariah now known forever, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a massive fraud whose son-in-law was going to federal prison and whose daughter-in-law secretly paid all her bills. Geraldine lunged forward and grabbed Terrence's arm with both of her shaking hands. Her manicured fingers dug desperately into the thick fabric of his winter coat. "Terrence, you have to fix this," she sobbed, her mascara running in dark, messy streaks down her pale cheeks. "You cannot let her do this to me, Terrence. You have to control your wife. Tell them she is lying. Tell the pastor she made it all up out of jealousy. You are my son. You have to protect your family from this vindictive woman." Terrence stopped walking. He did not look angry anymore. He just looked incredibly tired and profoundly sad. The illusion of the loving mother he had spent 35 years trying to please was standing right in front of him, begging him to destroy his own wife just to save her country club membership. He looked down at her hands gripping his coat, and then he looked at her face as if seeing her clearly for the very first time. Slowly and deliberately, Terrence reached over and peeled his mother fingers off his arm. He did it with the cold detachment of someone removing a poisonous leech. Geraldine gasped, stumbling back a half step in the slush as if he had physically struck her. Mother Terrence said, his voice incredibly steady and completely devoid of any warmth. "Sasha is the only reason you have lived like royalty for the past 5 years. She is the only reason you had a roof over your head in Cabo, the only reason you drank vintage champagne in Dubai, and the only reason you even had a birthday party to invite those women to tonight. You spent years mocking the very woman who was quietly keeping you from total bankruptcy. And how did you repay her incredible kindness? You locked her out in a blizzard, and you made my children sleep on the cold floor of a cabin." Geraldine opened her mouth to argue, to make another pathetic excuse, but the absolute finality in Terrence's eyes silenced her instantly. "You watched Preston steal from elderly people just to buy Vanessa another handbag." Terrence continued, stepping closer to her, forcing her to look him in the eye. "You sat there and smiled while he committed federal fraud because it kept the money flowing into your fake luxury lifestyle. You told everyone Sasha was a parasite when she was the only one actually working for a living. You tried to convince me to leave my own wife, the mother of my children, just so you could feel superior." I stood quietly beside him, watching the dynamic completely shift. I did not need to say a single word. Terrence was handling the woman who had tormented me, and he was doing it with a devastating, absolute clarity. Geraldine began to weep loudly, realizing that her manipulation tactics were completely useless against him now. She begged him to remember all the sacrifices she had made for him growing up, trying to weaponize his childhood loyalty one last time. Terrence shook his head, stepping back to stand firmly by my side. He wrapped his arm protectively around my waist, pulling me close against the winter chill. "You have no family left, Mother," he told her, his words cutting through the freezing air like a knife. "Vanessa is bankrupt and Preston is going to prison. And as of tonight, you no longer have a son. We are entirely done." Geraldine let out a pathetic, wailing sob, collapsing to her knees, right there in the dirty snow and slush of the parking lot. She reached a hand out toward us, begging and pleading, making empty promises she could never keep. But Terrence did not even look back. He opened the passenger door of our car for me, helping me inside where the heater was already running. He closed the door, firmly shutting out the miserable sound of his mother's frantic crying. As we drove away from the steakhouse, the neon sign fading in the rearview mirror, I looked over at my husband. The heavy burden he had carried for a lifetime was finally gone. He reached across the center console and took my hand, bringing my fingers to his lips. "I am so proud of you," he whispered, his eyes shining with profound relief. The nightmare was finally over. We were driving back to our beautiful kids, back to the warm luxury hotel suite, and back to a life that belonged only to us. The toxic family had finally destroyed themselves, and we were entirely free. Terrence had just put the luxury rental car into gear, ready to leave the frozen nightmare of the steakhouse parking lot forever, when a sudden blur of motion blocked our path. Geraldine did the absolute unthinkable. The grand matriarch of the family, The woman who cared more about the pristine condition of her designer shoes than she did about her own children threw her shivering body directly in front of the glowing headlights of our vehicle. Terrence slammed his foot on the brakes, causing the heavy tires to skid slightly on the icy slush. We jolted forward in our seats as the car came to a sudden halt. Before either of us could even process what was happening, Geraldine scrambled around the hood of the car like a desperate animal. Her ruined rented dress was clinging to her freezing legs, and her hair was plastered to her wet face. She slammed her bare hands against the passenger side window where I was sitting. Her face was pressed desperately against the cold glass, her eyes wide and wild with a terrifying level of panic. Over at the restaurant entrance, the valet stand was still crowded with the last remaining members of her elite social circle. The wealthy women in their heavy furs and diamond jewelry stood completely frozen, watching this final act of absolute degradation unfold under the harsh parking lot lights. Geraldine was making a massive scene, exactly the kind of trashy public spectacle she had spent her entire life judging other people for. I pressed the button to roll down the window just a few inches. The biting winter wind immediately whipped into the warm, quiet cabin of the car, but I did not flinch. I simply sat there and stared at the woman who had made my life a living hell for the past 10 years. "Sasha, please," she gasped, her breath forming frantic white clouds in the freezing night air. "Please, you have to fix this. You are the only one who can fix this. Tell them it is all a misunderstanding. Tell Martha and the pastor that Preston just made a clerical error and the firm overreacted. You have the money, Sasha. You have millions. You can pay back the wealth management firm before the federal agents really dig into the accounts. You can save our family from this scandal." I looked at her, feeling an overwhelming wave of absolute nothingness. There was no pity in my heart for this woman. There was no sympathy for her self-inflicted ruin. When I did not immediately respond to her ridiculous demands, Geraldine realized that her usual manipulation tactics were entirely useless. The authority she once wielded was completely gone. So she did the only thing she had left. The proud, arrogant woman dropped straight to her knees in the dirty, freezing slush right outside my car door. The collective gasp from the country club women standing at the valet stand was audible, even over the sound of the idling car engine. Geraldine was kneeling in the dirty snow, staining her expensive clothes, clasping her hands together and holding them up to me in a pathetic begging motion. "Please, Sasha, I am literally begging you," she wailed, her voice echoing across the quiet parking lot for all her elite friends to hear. "I will do anything you want. I will apologize to you in front of the whole church congregation. I will force Vanessa to get on her knees and apologize to you too. Just please open the estate for us. Let us stay at your property until this horrible mess blows over. Vanessa is going to lose her house to the federal agents, and I cannot go back to sleeping in that awful tiny cabin. Please just open the doors of your estate for us. I will be your servant if you want me to. I will cook and clean and do anything you ask. Just do not leave us out here in the cold." The absolute truth of our family dynamic was now laid bare for the entire high society of the town to witness. The woman who had spent the entire evening calling me a toxic poor parasite was currently groveling in the mud begging me for housing and money. Geraldine was the beggar, and I was the one holding all the power she so desperately craved. I looked down at her shivering form, remembering every cruel comment about my background, every deliberate attempt to ruin my marriage, and every time she had made Terrence feel like he was not good enough. "You want me to save you?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and steady, carrying clearly through the crisp night air, so the women at the valet stand could hear every word. "You want me to use my hard-earned money to cover up your golden son-in-law's federal crimes just so you can keep pretending you are inherently better than everyone else?" "Yes, please," Geraldine sobbed, nodding frantically, her pride entirely broken. "You are family, Sasha, we are family. You have to help your family. You were never my family." "Geraldine," I said, looking her dead in her tear-filled eyes, Real family does not treat people the way you treated me for a decade. Real family does not try to destroy their own sons' happiness just to maintain a fake image of superiority. You made your choices a long time ago. You chose the fake wealth, you chose the toxic lies, and you chose Preston's stolen money over your own son's integrity. You enabled a criminal because he bought you expensive dinners, and now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. She let out a horrific wail, reaching her muddy hands up to grab the edge of the open car window. "Please do not do this to me, Sasha," she cried out, her voice hoarse and broken. "I have nothing left. My friends hate me. My reputation is destroyed and I have nowhere to go. Please just let us stay in the guest room at the estate. I am begging you." I looked down at the pathetic woman kneeling in the dirty snow. The grand matriarch had been entirely stripped of all her fake glory, reduced to begging the very woman she despised. I leaned slightly closer to the open window, locking my gaze with hers, making sure she saw the absolute finality in my eyes. "I told you on Wednesday, Geraldine." I said my words slow and deliberate, ensuring she heard every single syllable. "Vanessa's family gets the guest room. You can take the floor." I hit the button, and the window rolled up smoothly, cutting off her agonizing scream of total despair. Terrence did not hesitate for a single second. He put the car in reverse, maneuvering smoothly and carefully around the sobbing woman on the ground, and then shifted into drive. We pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the bright neon lights of the cheap steakhouse behind us. I looked in the side mirror one last time and saw Geraldine collapsed in the slush, surrounded by the judgmental stares of the elite women she had worshipped her entire life. A profound and beautiful peace settled over the warm cabin of our car as we drove into the snowy night, finally leaving the toxic ruins of their fake empire behind us forever. The heavy tires of our luxury rental car crunched against the fresh snow as Terrence navigated us down the winding mountain road. The glowing neon sign of the steakhouse disappeared behind the thick line of pine trees, completely swallowing the final pathetic image of Geraldine kneeling in the slush. We drove in a comfortable silence for the first few miles. The heater was blowing warm air across my frozen legs, slowly thawing the physical chill of the parking lot confrontation. Mr. Harrington had walked out of the restaurant doors right behind us, his face a mask of absolute corporate determination. We had watched his sleek black town car pull out of the parking lot, taking a sharp right turn at the main intersection. The managing partner had delivered the ultimate corporate execution, and now he was heading back to the city, leaving the wreckage of Preston's career in his rearview mirror. As we approached the main highway, the quiet peace of the winter night was suddenly shattered by a piercing mechanical scream. A fleet of police cruisers came tearing around the bend, their red and blue emergency lights violently illuminating the dark, snowy forest. Terrence pulled our car slightly toward the shoulder to let them pass. We watched 4 police cars roar past us, heading directly toward the cheap steakhouse we had just left. Those sirens were the ultimate soundtrack to Vanessa's absolute destruction. They were heading there to officially haul Preston away to a federal holding cell and to begin the agonizing process of tearing apart every single financial lie Vanessa had built her arrogant life upon. I watched the flashing lights disappear into the distance, feeling a profound sense of closure. For an entire decade, Vanessa had paraded around family events showing off designer handbags and diamond necklaces that were essentially funded by stolen money. She had looked down her nose at me, calling me a poor baker while she was secretly married to a desperate criminal. Now the federal authorities were going to strip away every stolen luxury she owned, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of public humiliation. The tension that had been coiled tight in my shoulders for the past 10 years finally began to unravel. I took a deep, shaking breath and exhaled slowly, letting the stale air of a decade of abuse leave my lungs. It was a physical sensation, like a heavy iron vest being unbuckled and lifted off my chest. For so long, I had been the designated scapegoat of this family. I was the punching bag for Geraldine's insecurities, and the quiet target for Vanessa's relentless jealousy. I had bitten my tongue at countless Thanksgiving dinners. I had swallowed my pride during miserable holiday vacations. I had allowed them to treat me like a lower-class citizen because I mistakenly believed that keeping the peace was more important than protecting my own dignity. But sitting here in the quiet warmth of the car, I realized the absolute truth. Keeping the peace with toxic people is just another form of self-destruction. Terrence reached across the center console and rested his large, warm hand over mine. His grip was firm and incredibly grounding. He did not look back toward the direction of the restaurant. His eyes were focused entirely on the road ahead of us. "We did it," he said, his voice soft, but filled with a quiet, undeniable strength. "We are finally free from them, Sasha." I turned to look at my husband, studying the relaxed lines of his face. The perpetual knot of anxiety that usually formed between his eyebrows whenever he had to deal with his mother was completely gone. He had finally chosen our marriage over her toxic manipulation. He had watched his mother beg and plead, and he had coldly walked away, knowing that her tears were nothing more than a desperate performance to save her own social standing. I squeezed his hand, leaning my head back against the soft leather headrest. "Yes, we are," I whispered. The transition was entirely complete. I was no longer the quiet, struggling daughter-in-law desperate for their validation. I was the undeniable victor. I had built a massive, successful business empire entirely in the shadows while they spent all their energy trying to project a fake image of wealth. I had secured my financial future and protected my family, while they drowned in a sea of credit card debt and federal fraud. True power, I realized, did not need to be loud or flashy. True power did not require bragging at country club luncheons or belittling other people to feel important. True power was the ability to stand quietly in your own truth, knowing you held all the cards and having the discipline to wait for the perfect moment to play them. The ultimate revenge was not just watching them fall, it was knowing I was the one who had outgrown their tiny, toxic world. We turned off the main highway onto the private, scenic road that led toward my estate. The heavy snow was falling gently now, coating the tall pine trees in a pristine layer of white. The landscape looked incredibly peaceful, completely untouched by the ugly drama unfolding a few miles away. I thought about Geraldine sleeping on the floor of that tiny, miserable cabin tonight. I thought about how she would have to face the freezing morning without her elite friends, without her fake respectability, and without the son she had tried so hard to control. Her punishment was entirely of her own making. She had worshipped the illusion of money so much that she allowed it to destroy her entire family. The massive iron gates of my property appeared through the falling snow. Terrence pressed the remote, and the gates swung open smoothly, welcoming us into the beautiful sanctuary I had built with my own hard work. The long driveway was perfectly plowed, and the warm golden lights of the main house glowed invitingly against the dark winter sky. This was my kingdom. It was not built on stolen escrow funds or fake credit cards. It was built on early mornings, late nights, and an unwavering belief in my own potential. Terrence parked the car near the front entrance and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet was absolute and incredibly beautiful. We sat there for a long moment, just holding hands and breathing in the reality of our new life. Inside that house, our children were sleeping safely in warm, comfortable beds, completely unaware of the toxic storm that had finally been permanently banished from their lives. They would never have to grow up feeling less than because of their grandmother's cruel comparisons. They would never have to watch their mother be humiliated at a family gathering ever again. I opened the car door and stepped out into the crisp mountain air. The cold wind kissed my cheeks, but I did not feel the chill. I took a deep, long breath, filling my lungs with the scent of pine and absolute freedom. The heavy, suffocating shadow of the past 10 years was permanently lifted. I looked up at the stars peeking through the breaking snow clouds, feeling a profound sense of triumph settling deep into my bones. The long, painful journey from the scapegoat to the victor was finally over, and the beautiful, peaceful rest of my life was just beginning. The days that followed our departure from that frozen parking lot moved with a breathtaking, brutal efficiency. While Terrence and I settled into the quiet, peaceful rhythm of our life at the estate, the fake empire his mother and sister had built was systematically dismantled brick by stolen brick. It started on Monday morning when federal agents officially indicted Preston on multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. The local news stations practically camped outside the wealth management firm, broadcasting the entire scandal to anyone who cared to watch. The full scope of Preston's crimes was staggering. He had not just stolen from the late Mrs. Thompson, he had been quietly siphoning funds from dozens of elderly clients for over 3 years, using their life savings to pay for Vanessa's designer shoes, her luxury leased vehicles, and the extravagant country club dinners that kept Geraldine at the top of the social ladder. Preston's bail was set at a number so astronomically high that it might as well have been $1 billion. His assets were immediately frozen by the federal government, and Vanessa was given exactly 48 hours to vacate the sprawling suburban mansion they had been renting under a shell company. The speed of her downfall was absolute. She had spent a decade treating everyone around her like peasants, bragging about her exclusive international vacations and mocking my simple background. Now she was standing on the front lawn of her repossessed home, watching federal investigators carry out boxes of her stolen designer bags and diamond jewelry to be auctioned off for victim restitution. She tried to call her wealthy friends for a place to stay, but every single number she dialed went straight to voicemail. The women she had spent years drinking expensive wine with wanted absolutely nothing to do with the wife of a disgraced federal criminal. With zero money, zero assets, and a husband sitting in a county jail cell awaiting federal transfer, Vanessa had only one option left. She packed what few cheap clothes the agents allowed her to keep into trash bags and took a city bus to her mother's cramped, heavily mortgaged house. The glorious reunion between the golden child and the matriarch was a miserable, claustrophobic nightmare. Vanessa was forced to move back into her tiny childhood bedroom, sleeping on a lumpy mattress surrounded by the cheap trinkets she used to despise. The walls of Geraldine's house echoed with their constant, bitter, screaming matches. Vanessa blamed her mother for pushing them to steal, while Geraldine blamed Vanessa for marrying a stupid criminal who got caught. They were two incredibly toxic women, trapped in a tiny space with no one left to manipulate but each other. But the absolute worst blow for Geraldine did not come from her daughter's bankruptcy. The ultimate punishment arrived in a thick cream-colored envelope delivered by certified mail 1 week later. Geraldine had spent her entire adult life centering her identity around her prestigious alumni sorority chapter. It was her crown jewel, her primary weapon of social intimidation, and the foundation of her entire superiority complex. The letter inside the envelope was signed by the national chapter president and the regional board of directors. It coldly informed Geraldine that due to the highly publicized criminal fraud associated with her immediate family and her own deeply embarrassing public spectacle at the steakhouse, her membership was being permanently revoked, effective immediately. She was officially stripped of her letters, banned from all future charity luncheons, and completely exiled from the only social circle that ever gave her life meaning. She tried to show up at the country club the next day to plead her case in person, but the security guards at the front gate had already been given strict orders not to let her vehicle onto the property. She sat in her outdated car at the security checkpoint, screaming and crying at the teenage guard, demanding to speak to the club manager, until she was finally threatened with police intervention for trespassing. The wealthy women she had spent decades kissing up to drove past her in their luxury cars, purposefully turning their heads the other way, refusing to even acknowledge her existence. She was a ghost in the very town she once thought she ruled. The absolute finality of their isolation was sealed by our own actions. Terrence and I did not gloat. We did not send angry text messages or seek petty revenge. We simply erased them from our universe entirely. Terrence changed his phone number the morning after the steakhouse incident. He deleted his social media accounts and instructed the security team at my estate that under no circumstances were Geraldine or Vanessa allowed within a mile of our gates. When Vanessa tried to call my design firm, begging my receptionist to let her speak to me because they could not afford to pay the electric bill, I simply told the receptionist to block the number. They were completely and permanently cut off from the massive wealth they had spent years trying to exploit. The financial safety net they had always taken for granted simply ceased to exist. They had burned the only bridge that could have saved them, and now they were stranded on an island of their own making. There was no more secret rent money arriving in their bank accounts. There were no more anonymous checks paying off their credit card debts. There were no more luxury vacations quietly funded by the daughter-in-law they treated like dirt. They were finally forced to face the brutal reality of their actual financial situation and the absolute emptiness of their social status. Every single time Terrence looked at me in the weeks that followed, there was a profound lightness in his eyes. He had spent his entire life carrying the heavy, suffocating burden of trying to be the perfect son to a mother who only valued him for what he could provide. Now he was just a husband and a father, completely devoted to the family we had built together. The toxic shadows that had haunted the corners of our marriage were completely gone, washed away by the brilliant sunlight of our new reality. The fake royalty had fallen, and the true peace we had fought so hard for had finally been won. November arrived, bringing with it a deep, biting cold and a thick blanket of pristine white snow across the Colorado mountains. Thanksgiving morning dawned bright and incredibly peaceful at our Aspen estate. There were no frantic phone calls from Geraldine, demanding that we arrive early to set up her catered buffet. There were no passive-aggressive text messages from Vanessa complaining about my outfit choices or bragging about her latest stolen designer purchase. There was only the quiet crackle of the massive stone fireplace and the sweet smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon apples filling the warm air of our home. For the first time in my entire adult life, Thanksgiving was not a dreaded, exhausting obligation. It was not a miserable battlefield disguised as a family holiday. It was simply a day of profound and beautiful gratitude. Miles and Layla were running happily through the sprawling hallways of the mansion, their joyful laughter echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. They were chasing each other around the massive leather sofas, completely carefree and untethered from the heavy toxic expectations that used to crush them at family gatherings. I watched my son slide across the polished hardwood floor in his thick wool socks, a massive grin lighting up his little face. There was no domineering grandmother here to scold him for being too loud or to compare him unfavorably to Vanessa's spoiled, arrogant children. There was no underlying tension hovering in the air, waiting to suddenly strike and ruin the mood. They did not have to worry about using the wrong fork, or speaking out of turn, or wearing an outfit that did not meet a ridiculous country club standard. They were simply allowed to be happy, normal children, safe in a house where they were unconditionally loved and celebrated for exactly who they were. I walked into the massive gourmet kitchen and found Terrence standing by the marble island, carefully pouring expensive red wine into crystal glasses. He was wearing a simple, soft cashmere sweater and comfortable jeans, looking more relaxed and handsome than I had seen him in over a decade. The heavy, permanent exhaustion that used to violently weigh down his shoulders had completely vanished. He looked up as I entered the kitchen, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. His eyes, which used to be so guarded and anxious whenever the holiday season approached, were now bright and filled with an absolute unshakable peace. He walked over to me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me into a deep, comforting embrace. We stood there together, listening to the joyful chaos of our children playing in the great room. It was hard to truly fathom how drastically our lives had changed in just a few short weeks. While we were preparing a feast in our multi-million-dollar mountain sanctuary, Geraldine and Vanessa were likely sitting in that cramped, heavily mortgaged house back in the suburbs, screaming at each other over a cheap store-bought turkey. They were trapped in the miserable, claustrophobic prison of their own making, completely cut off from the massive wealth and high status they had, worshipped their entire lives. We had not heard a single word from them since the federal agents raided Vanessa's home, and we had absolutely zero intention of ever speaking to them again. They were bitter ghosts from a past life that we had permanently and successfully left behind. Later that afternoon, we gathered around the long custom dining table. It was just the four of us, and it was absolutely perfect. The table was covered in beautiful, rich food that we had cooked together as a family. Miles and Layla were chattering excitedly about the giant snowmen they were going to build later that afternoon, completely oblivious to the dark, toxic drama we had permanently shielded them from. Terrence stood up at the head of the table, holding his crystal wine glass. The room quieted down as he looked at me, his expression incredibly tender and filled with a profound, overwhelming gratitude. "I want to make a toast," Terrence said, his voice thick with deep emotion. He looked down at Miles and Layla and then locked his gaze directly onto mine. For years, I thought that family meant obligation. I thought it meant constantly sacrificing your own happiness and peace of mind just to keep toxic, selfish people comfortable. But looking at this amazing table right now, I finally understand what real family is. Sasha, you completely saved us. You stood tall when they tried everything in their power to break you. You built an incredible, massive life for us in the shadows, and you had the absolute strength to walk away when the time was right. You gave me the courage to finally open my eyes and choose my real family. To my beautiful, brilliant wife, the woman who gave us this incredible peace, I love you more than words can ever say. We clinked our glasses together, the sweet sound of crystal ringing through the warm dining room. After dinner, while Terrence was helping the kids bundle up in their heavy snow gear, I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows in the great room. I stood there holding a warm cup of coffee, watching the heavy snow falling silently over the majestic mountain peaks. The landscape was breathtakingly beautiful, completely untouched and pure. It reminded me of the blank, wonderful canvas my life had become now that the suffocating weight of my former in-laws had been entirely removed. I thought about all those miserable, dreadful holidays sitting at Geraldine's overly decorated dining table, listening to her make subtle, cruel digs at my background while Vanessa flaunted her stolen diamonds. I thought about the tears I had shed in secret and the silent prayers I had whispered, just asking for the strength to survive another brutal family gathering without completely losing my mind. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the profound warmth of the moment wash over my entire soul. For years, I had tried so incredibly hard to mold myself into a shape that Geraldine and Vanessa would find acceptable. I had swallowed my pride, dimmed my own light, and constantly shrunk myself down just to fit into their twisted, toxic picture frame. But as I looked out over the vast, breathtaking estate that I had purchased with my own brilliant mind and relentless hard work, I finally understood the ultimate truth. True power is never about twisting yourself into painful knots to fit into a toxic family's cheap, fragile picture frame. True power is having the absolute strength to walk away, buy the entire gallery, and hang your own magnificent masterpiece. The nightmare was permanently over, and my beautiful, peaceful masterpiece had only just begun. The greatest lesson from Sasha's journey is that your true worth is never defined by people committed to misunderstanding you. When you stop trying to fit into spaces that require you to shrink, you finally give yourself the room to grow. Real family is not about strict obligation, but about mutual respect and support. Setting firm boundaries with toxic people is not an act of cruelty. It is simply an act of profound self-love. Tell us your story in the comments below. If you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to protect your peace, and subscribe for more journeys of healing.